Again, I'm talking to my good friend Rania Khalek, raniakhalek.com. I actually want to move on because you wrote, we've kind of talked about kind of the American side of this. We brought up the Iraqi side with the war in Iraq, but you wrote a really great piece for Al Jazeera America about how in Syria there actually is, we focus on Assad, we focus on some of the rebel fighters and their ties to Al Qaeda and all that. That's something that people really kind of focus on. But you actually wrote for Al Jazeera America about how the voices of nonviolence in Syria are being drowned out, and there's actually a pretty loud voice of nonviolence in Syria. So tell us all about your piece.
Yeah, so one thing that's really been missing from this discussion is the people who started the initial uprising back in March of 2011 were Syrians, obviously, in Syria.
Yeah.
And it was really similar to the kind of activism, the kind of inspirational, let's get into the streets and take down our dictator sort of uprising that we saw in Egypt and Tunisia, that sort of had that domino effect around the Middle East. And in March of 2011, all these these Syrian youths who had generally been apolitical before rose up, and at first they weren't even demanding regime change; they were just demanding reforms.
Mm-hmm.
And the reaction from the Syrian government, which is historically under the Assad regime, and under his father and now him. It's a very much a police state, a security state that is that relies on an army to keep people in check, that doesn't allow any sort of oppositional voices. At least they do to a certain extent. And so they reacted very violently, like most places would, just like Egypt did. They reacted very violently to this uprising, and people were imprisoned, and people, young people who were participating were tortured, and despite all that, even after a few months, some elements of the uprising armed themselves to really mostly defend themselves. So a lot of the uprising was occurring in a lot of rural areas. That's where it was kind of the strongest. And so, yeah, some people took up arms to defend themselves. And, I certainly, in my own view, there are extremists that are fighting alongside the rebels, and there are atrocities being committed by the rebels. No doubt. But at the same time, it can't be denied that there's people who arm themselves in the beginning to defend themselves from a really brutal regime. And so anyways, so yeah, but despite all of this, there are so many people who began that uprising who are still working, in the nonviolent opposition, and they're doing so much work. A lot of it has moved towards more humanitarian relief. Because things have gotten so horrific, but they're still doing really, really incredible work. There's the Syrian nonviolence movement. There's Syria First. There's kind of like a whole network of these organizations that sort of work, not necessarily together, but they sort of have a base of operations almost, where they're still doing a lot of organizing, a lot of workshops. They're forming local city councils in rebel-held areas. They're forming their own humanitarian relief organizations. They're trying to do as much as they can to educate or help children in the area and areas they're in who are internally displaced or haven't been in school for years since this began. Because there's so much incredible work they're doing. They're committed to nonviolence. And a lot of them, the majority of them, I don't want to say that they're a monolith, but the majority of people that I spoke to who are nonviolent Syrian activists were adamantly opposed to U.S. Military intervention, and they strongly rejected the idea that this war is they obviously they say yes, it's become a civil war, but they rejected this sort of binary of Assad versus Al Qaeda because it's bigger than that. It's more than that. And their voices have been completely drowned out by the violence, and a lot of that has to do with if it bleeds, it leads. But also just the narrative that's been pushed has excluded the fact that there are Syrians doing really, really important opposition work, and it's been on both sides too that this has been happening, not just on sort of the more war hawk side or even the objective, journalist side, but also on the left, not the entire left, but there's been elements of the anti-war left that have really ignored these groups and have almost sort of adopted this sort of pro-Assad rhetoric.
Yeah.
And a part of that, in my own analysis, a part of that I think has to do with the fact that the U.S. wants to bomb Assad. So it's sort of this automatic position of, oh, well, Assad is an anti-imperialist.
Right, yeah.
So let's and he's a little bit glorified. And so that's upsetting because,
because he's a monster.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, to defend him is clearly incorrect. This actually does have a little more subtlety to this. Just because the United States does want to bomb him doesn't mean he's a good dude. That just having some of that knee jerk reaction to it is false.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But even more importantly, of course, is this. Don't get me wrong, there are Syrians I spoke to, and they're Syrians who mostly live in the rebel-held areas, which are the areas that are being shelled the hardest by Assad because he's not in control of them anymore. And it's really, really horrific. I mean, those are the areas where the refugees have been fleeing from, where their houses have been destroyed. And because, the areas that are still under the Assad regime control haven't changed that much. There's obviously shooting and shelling that's heard in the background all the time, but people are still out and about. They're still able to go out to dinner and able to go to school. Whereas in these other areas, it's just like two different worlds. And so it's understandable when Syrians in refugee camps or even Syrian activists, a couple of them I spoke to, it's understandable when they're like, yes, please bomb Assad. I don't agree with it, but I understand where they're coming from.
Sure.
But I just don't think that that's going to help. But yeah, the majority of the nonviolent activists I spoke to are also saying that they've not only have they been ignored by the media, but they've largely been ignored by the international community, mostly the actors who have sort of turned this into their own proxy war, whether it's the Gulf states who have been focusing solely on arming the rebels. And, a lot of people are saying the arms are flowing mostly to these extremist groups, like, and you've got places like Saudi Arabia sending like fighters to go fight jihad in Syria, and in Turkey is kind of supporting that as well. And then you've got Russia backing Assad, and no matter what. And so they're really upset because it's like the international community. The majority of people I spoke to want a diplomatic solution. They want some sort of political solution to stop the bloodshed that's happening now. That's like the first priority, is to stop the bloodshed that's happening from going any further. And instead, they feel like they're getting derailed over and over again because no one's paying attention to them. And it's all the attention is going to either arming the rebels or arming Assad, and none of it's going to them. And it's really, really upsetting because, these are the people that are, going to be the sort of foundation of any future Syria that is, post-Assad Syria that is hopefully at some point in time going to be more inclusive, going to be more democratic. These are the people who are going to be who are trying to lay down the framework for that. And it's really hard to do that when the country is constantly destroying itself. So yeah, it's really, really important that these voices get some airtime. Because they're so smart. They have so much to say. They're actually experiencing what's happening in Syria, and even people inside Syria. They are very, they know what's going on. A lot of them are very anti-intervention from the West because they're very, very familiar with U.S. foreign
with
policy.
What that means, yeah.
With the ramifications of U.S. foreign policy. They're familiar with what we do to countries that we intervene in. So, that was sort of the whole point of my piece, is to say, look, there's all these people who aren't getting any attention, even by the media, who should be paying attention to them. They're actual Syrian voices, and they have a lot of really important things to say. Let's listen to them.
Yeah. When you talk to them, what is there anything that they what do they want? Do they want anything from the international community? What do they want from the international community? What would they like to see from the U.S.? Because obviously a lot of them don't want to see Syria bombed. What do they actually want to see done from the international community? Anything, or do they actually want to see some type of? Obviously not. They don't want a military intervention. A lot of the nonviolent groups. But what do they want to see from the international community when you were talking to them?
Well, first and foremost, they want they need humanitarian relief. That's what they say. They say that's the number one thing, and it's not just from the U.S. It's from the international community. This is a crisis of epic proportions. You have 100,000 people, over 100,000 people are said to be dead from this crisis. You've got millions and millions of refugees flooding into other countries that aren't able to accommodate them. Like Lebanon, it's like 1 in every 4 Lebanese people living in Lebanon right now is a Syrian refugee. Lebanon's a really tiny country, and there's refugees, just living in awful, horrific conditions. And over half the refugees are children under the age of 11. It's really, really, it's an epic, epic crisis. And this is, I think, where help needs to start, because it's not there right now. None of them have an answer, but they know that the international community needs to step up and deal with that situation immediately. It's an immediate crisis. People are dying of hunger and starvation. There's disease. It's really atrocious, the conditions. There aren't even enough refugee camps to accommodate all the refugees. In Turkey, there's people that are just moving from whatever street corner to street corner they can, because there's no room in the refugee camps. They've been turned away. And, in Turkey, the Turkish police won't let them stay in one, random park for longer than a certain amount of days. So, that's what needs to be addressed first and foremost. There's also lots of, millions of internally displaced Syrians, even more, there's 4 million or something along those lines, who, need assistance, immediately. These are sort of the first things that people want addressed. Those are the priorities. On top of that, the other biggest priority was the people who have leverage to stop the bloodshed need to stop the bloodshed. So the West and the Gulf states who are backing the rebels, extremists or not, need to use their leverage to stop the rebels and, to get a ceasefire on that end. And Russia and Iran need to use their leverage to get, Assad to agree to a ceasefire. That's the first. There's not much you can do when there's still fighting going on, when there's still bombs being dropped. So it's before you can even get to that diplomatic solution, that has to be the first step. So those are the two things that I heard over and over again. And that's not what's happening. With this whole, and another thing that I heard people repeat was that the whole focus on chemical weapons, it's chemical weapons are terrible. People died by, if it seems like they were used and people died, and that's horrific and that should be dealt with. If Assad did it, whoever did it committed a serious war crime and should be held accountable, right? But at the same time, it's that's a teeny tiny fraction of the people who died. There's been over 100,000 deaths. So it's let's focus on the fact that there's other bombs as well that are harming people more so than chemical weapons by far, that are being used to kill. And so that's let's stop those arms from flowing, not just the chemical, not just condemn the chemical weapons, because it's people have been dying from cluster bombs and from barrel bombs and all kinds of any other bomb you can think of that's been being used on civilian populations. So yeah, that needs to be looked at as well. It's let's focus on chemical weapons is sort of totally misses the whole crisis.